Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Arwa Damon, and I am a CNN senior international correspondent, heavily focused on the Middle East, and I'm also the president and co-founder of the charity Inara. I have been covering Syria since the beginning, and I remember the first internally displaced people that I saw back in the summer of 2011. Back then, they were from Jisr al-Shughur, just a few hundred people in makeshift tents that were made out of tarps and plastic, children playing in a small stream, mothers clutching babies, teenagers tapping on iPhones. And back then, they thought it would just be days before they would be able to go back home. They never did. And when I think back on the last 11 years, I have this sort of Rolodex of memories that I call my freeze frame moments. And even as I speak about it right now, I can still remember, I can still see them. I can see the bunker in Baba Amr that was so dark, filled with children and mothers, that all I could actually see peering into that darkness was just the whites of their widened eyes, the fear that was there that was absolutely palpable. I remember their voices, the questions that they were asking, the same questions that so many of us who covered Syria or worked in any aspect to do with Syria heard over and over again. Those questions that would echo for the next decade of, why isn't anyone helping us? Doesn't anyone care? How can the world watch this and do nothing? I remember the mother sitting in the hospital next to her little boy who was swathed in bandages, his face pockmarked with shrapnel, her own tears very soft and quiet as she was talking about her other child who had been killed. And I also remember this crushing sensation that I had as a journalist, the sensation of feeling that I somehow must have failed. For surely if I had succeeded in translating the horror and the pain that I had witnessed, that had been documented by countless other journalists and activists on the ground, then something would have been different, would have ended up different for those who had been suffering. And I remember years into the war, once again covering yet another mass movement inside Syria in Idlib province that was again due to an intensification of bombardment by the Russian Air Force, by the Syrian regime. And in this particular instance, it was winter, freezing cold. And we came across groups of children who were just wearing flip flops and their cheeks were reddened from the bitter chill. They were cold, they were hungry, they were scared, but something was wrong. And I looked around at my crew and we were trying to figure out what it was. And my producer, who's a mother, said, Arwa, these children should be crying. And that's when the realization hit me. The trauma of Syria's children was so deep that the children didn't cry anymore. I think one of the key things we need to remember going into this discussion is that even when the spotlight was on Syria, the humanitarian needs of Syria were never fully met. The needs of children who know nothing but life on the run, who have never once spent one single night in a bed, in a space that they can actually call a home in the sense of the way many of us who are watching this right now actually identify a home as being. And now, 11 years into this conflict, there is an entire generation of children who don't know, who have no actual memory of their own of what life without war is actually like. And look, the media spotlight has long shifted away. And now organizations are struggling more than they ever did before to get funding. But at the same time, the needs of Syria's children continue to grow and continue to get even more dire. Inside Syria right now, we have more than 6 million children who need assistance. Millions more are living as refugees in neighboring countries. And for more than a decade, they've been in what's perhaps best described as survival mode. They don't know what the next day is going to bring. Their parents can't give them any guarantees of what the next day is going to bring. And they face grave violations of their rights, their right to a childhood, their right to live in a safe environment, their right to an education, their right to health. When the war in Ukraine broke out more than a month ago now, I, like many others who were watching it, was absolutely horrified. I know what war looks like. I know what it does to a person, to a children's psyche, how it just shreds apart reality and everything that an individual holds on to, how home is no longer safe. And I remember feeling for the Ukrainian population so deeply, the way I know that many of my journalist colleagues did, and the way that I know many Syrians themselves also did. But at the same time, I also felt my heart sinking because I thought to myself, as did many others, this is going to divert so much away from Syria in terms of funding and also in terms of what little attention was already being paid to Syria. I remember being in Poland covering the exodus from Ukraine, and I was watching families coming across the border, and my mind just sort of automatically superimposed similar images from having covered the exodus from Syria. I saw the same exhaustion in every step that the Ukrainians who were fleeing took. I saw the same horror and fear etched across their faces, the same look in their eyes, the same way that tiny hands clutched bigger ones that no longer knew how to keep them safe. That no longer knew how to keep them safe. And I also saw how Europeans greeted Ukrainians, not with border guards firing tear gas or herding them into fields as if they were cattle, but rather with mountains of clothes and immediate transport and warm places to stay. And that was a beautiful thing to witness. But the contrast between what I saw there and how I saw Syrian and other refugees being greeted in Europe was very jarring and very hurtful. And I wrote in an op-ed for CNN at the time, the pain is universal. The reaction to it should be as well. But all that being said, just because a situation is desperate and overwhelming, and just because it may feel like we're banging against a wall that won't budge, we don't stop trying to help those who are most in need. And it is in that spirit that we're coming together this morning. And thank you all for giving us your time today to listen to this conversation, to talk about the needs, the aspirations, the concerns of Syria's children and youth. This is an event that is brought together by the Malcolm H. Care Carnegie Middle East Center, UNICEF, Gallup International, ORBI, and the No Lost Generation Initiative. And throughout the course of the next hour and a half, our panelists will be providing you with an overview of the situation of Syria's children, both through an examination of the global and highly complex regional dynamics, but also by presenting their own voices, the voices of Syria's children. And this is also so that we can kickstart a conversation about the future of aid, especially given the multiple needs of children inside Syria and in neighboring countries in this very complex political context and emerging crisis. And so to start us off in this discussion, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Marwan Moashid, who is the Vice President of Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Dr. Marwan, how do you see, and I realize this is a very loaded question, the situation inside Syria now 11 years down the line? When we talk about sort of the battlefield dynamics, it's often described as being a stalemate. And then, of course, you have the added dynamic of seeing this new-ish approach with the rapprochement that exists between Arab countries and Syria. I mean, can we even say that the war in Syria is over?
First, Arwa, I want to thank you for a very moving introduction that you did, and one that describes exactly the plight of Syrians in this region and the reaction that we have seen in the West to their plight as compared to the plight of the Ukrainians also. For better or for worse, I'm sad to say that the Assad regime seems to be staying for a while. 11 years later, the world has tired of the Syrian crisis. The fear from radical elements taking over Syria has unfortunately led to the conclusion among many countries that they better deal with a regime which has killed hundreds of thousands of its own people. Yes, there is rapprochement today going on between the Assad regime and between several Arab states. I'm not sure that we can draw from that the Assad regime is going to be completely rehabilitated in the region. There are still many, many countries in Europe, in the US, elsewhere, that do not trust this regime and that do not intend to normalize their relations with them. In fact, I compare the situation to maybe that of Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War in 1991, where the regime did survive, but in a very weakened state. Remember that Syrians have lost millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of people killed directly because of the regime. And I think it is going to be very difficult over the long run to believe that Syrians are going to accept this regime indefinitely. For the time being, I'm afraid that the regime is there, and that has several implications, not the least of which having to do with the refugee situation. Today, you have almost half the country either as refugees or displaced people within Syria. As international experience tells us, refugees almost never go back. In the last 100 years, other than the example of Kosovo, maybe one example that I can't even think of now, refugees don't go back. They either stay in their country or they are repatriated to their host countries, or they are repatriated to third countries, which means that we have to start looking at the refugee problem, not just in humanitarian terms, and the humanitarian implications are very heavy, but also in terms of its effect on the economy of these people, the security of the countries they are in, and for the purposes of this discussion, on the well-being of and education of the children, the Syrian children, millions of whom today are not receiving education, at least proper education, either in the host countries or within Syria as they are displaced. We cannot afford to have a generation of Syrians that is not educated. That is going to throw development, not just in that country, but across the region, decades back. And we have to do everything we can to ensure that these children receive proper education that would keep their hopes alive of a better future for them and for their communities. The Ukrainian crisis, as you said rightly, so Arwa, has not helped. The Ukrainian crisis has meant that attention from the problem is going to be further deflected. I think attention from the Syrian crisis has already been deflected even before the Ukrainian crisis started. But with the Ukrainian crisis, we're going to face a situation, unfortunately, where further deflection of attention from the international community will take place. And that means that we truly need all we can do in order to help these children. And this event is but a small effort in order to do that.
Yeah, that's very true. And, I've speculated quite a bit and sort of put the question out there as to, had the international community reacted in a more cohesive, stronger way to what was happening in Syria, would we have seen Russia take the actions that we saw it take against Ukraine?
Imagine, Arwa, if the Russians used chemical weapons today in Ukraine, would the international community stay silent the way it did with Syria? I doubt it.
Yeah, well, that is the unfortunate, tragic, and in many ways despicable reality of the world we live in. But that is perhaps why it's even more important that we are having the discussion that we're having today. For now, more of a look on what the last 11 years have really meant for Syria and its children, I would like to turn to our next panelist, Mr. Bertrand Banval, who is the Deputy Director of UNICEF for the Middle East and North Africa, and also the co-lead of the No Lost Generation initiative. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been 11 years, and I know it's extraordinarily difficult to try to describe what and how that has impacted Syria's children and their childhood. I have not met a single child from Syria who has not been impacted in some way. But if you could just try to, help those who are listening in today begin to understand, what this war has looked like from a child's perspective and from UNICEF's perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Arwa, really for your introduction, also for painting in a very stark terms what already the situation is. And let me thank also the Carnegie Center really for helping us to bring back the attention of the world also on this 11-year crisis at the time when other crises, unfortunately, are affecting the world and the children in the world. So we very much appreciate your effort in that respect. As you rightly said, 11 years means that also for many children, it means that the only lives they've been knowing has been a life of war. And even, close to 6 million children have been born over the last 6 years. So they were born in the war and they continue living in this war. But, beyond the 6 million, of course, the war is affecting children in many, many, many ways. In very direct ways, 13,000 children since the beginning of the crisis have been either killed or injured. We have also 7,000 of them who have been recruited by armed group and armed forces. And now we are in a situation with the acceleration of the addition of the different crises happening in Syria on the top of the security crisis. You have also COVID, which came on the top of that, and now a socioeconomic crisis, which is making families and children even more vulnerable. This year, we see that we have the highest number of children ever recorded who are in need. 6.5 million children are in need of assistance. This is the highest since the beginning of the crisis. Let's remember that Syria, even years ago, was what we call a middle-income country. Now we see that 90% of the population live in poverty. So these figures mean concrete realities for families and children. As a result of that, we see now again in a country which had put under control quite a few issues like health and malnutrition. We see now that 1/3 of the children are chronically malnourished. And you said, Marwan also reminded us that, 3 million children are out of school. And when they are in school, we also can question also what they can learn. And what we can question it because I mentioned also how the war has been around the children, but war is inside the children as well. They've been deeply psychologically affected by the situation. Recent surveys we undertook in different communities showed us that 1/4 of the parents tell us that their children suffer from anxiety, have difficulties to concentrate on their learning, have problems in sleeping. So all of that, of course, has not only implications for now for the children today, but also as Marwan was telling us earlier, it has long-term implication. It is if it is not addressed. So, a big concern about 11 years of war. But I must say also that the last year has been even tougher for children. Because also of the economic crisis happening up. You mentioned the Ukrainian crisis, which is of course impacting directly Ukrainian children, but it is already impacting very strongly the children of Syria. We see some food price hikes, which are happening, stark ones, and we are very concerned because it will have impact on also on, of course, directly on nutrition, on poverty, but also on what we see developing, which are negative coping mechanisms taken by families. To give you two examples, we see, and we've been witnessing an increase in the reliance on child labor for families to be able to get additional type of income and based of the analysis of the opportunity cost, of sending a child to school versus having the child bring an income to the family. We saw also in very disturbing terms a trend which had been going in the right direction before the crisis, which is now going in the wrong direction, which is a trend in increasing numbers of child marriages, and again as a negative coping mechanism adopted by families. So this, all these figures, of course, it's figures, and we should not really forget that beyond all of these figures, there is a stark reality for each child and each family in Syria. So welcoming again the event of today, which help us to bring back an attention which has been waning over the years, attention of the world, but also attention of the donor community. And at a time when we're just commemorating the 11th year of a crisis. Very important meetings also happening these days, in the coming days, to also help us refocus on the Syria crisis. So the event of today is very welcome to help us also remind us not only of the situation, but what we should keep doing to make sure that indeed we don't end up having a lost generation of children with dire impact for the children today, for their rights and for their ability to grow, but also in terms of even security and regionally, the implications are going to be enormous. Thank you so much.
Yeah, they really are. And I think, a lot of us probably share a similar frustration in the sense that, on a global level, when it comes to, the global community and the donor community that you're talking about right there, it seems as if we are somehow incapable of focusing on more than one crisis area at the same time without, at this stage at least, seemingly having learned what the cost of negligence or inaction actually is. And as you're talking, I was reminded of a story I was covering that I would just like to share for a second that, maybe helps illustrate some of the psychological impact of all of this on children. So I had met a young girl. She was about 13 years old at the time, and this was a year ago. So we're talking about, 10 years into the war in Syria. She had lost her leg to a mine. Her father had been disappeared when she was just a child. He had been pulled out of a car, at a regime checkpoint. She never heard from him again. And I was talking to her, and it's a question that, we ask a lot of children, what kind of a future do you dream about? And we assume that the answer is going to be a future without war, a future where I can go to school. And she responded to that question by saying, well, I don't dream about a future. And then I asked her, well, what about a future without war? And she said, no. And that's when I realized that, you can't dream about a future that you don't know. And another thing that these children have lost is their ability to dream up a better life for themselves. That actual goal that could be out there for them has been taken away from them. So I just felt like that might be a bit of a story to be able to share at this stage as we continue talking about the impact of the war on children with our next panelist right now, Catherine Aquinas, who is the Media and Communications Director for Save the Children's Syria response, and also a member of the No Lost Generation Initiative. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking about the impact of this war on children, the war inside that exists for them that Bertrand was just speaking about. I mean, these psychological scars are extraordinarily difficult to try to describe and comprehend, given that many of us, frankly, have been quite fortunate not to have experienced it ourselves. But from your vantage point, from your perspective, I mean, how can we reshape this aid access reality so that we are able to better deliver to Syria's children and respond to their needs?
Thanks, Awa, and thank you for the story you just raised. I was struck as I was listening to you about some of the children I have been talking to in northeast Syria at the end of last year. And when we asked them what they were dreaming of, one of them said, I dream of a wall. I want to sit not in a tent. I want to sit with my back against a wall, and I want to shut the door against the cold weather. And it really shows how shrinking these children's lives are in many ways, that these are the things, these are their aspirations now. And it really shows that after 11 years of conflict, as Bertrand said, the scale and types of need that we see from children are growing in size and complexity and consequence. I mean, we see the immediate impact of active conflict, particularly in the Northwest right now, but we also, as Bertrand said, see the consequences of conflict, the consequences of protracted displacement, the deteriorating economy, the psychological toll that 11 years of conflict takes not only on children, but their parents and their ability to take care of their children. And this is all accumulated to really drive and leave millions of children in need. And while we grapple with this increasingly difficult global climate and multiple competing crises, it's really incumbent on us now, for those of us who work in and for Syrian children, to look at what we need to do differently after 11 years, when the situation only continues to get worse and worse for children in the country, and the global geopolitical context in which we work continues to get more difficult. And so it's for that reason that we need to look at the different types of aid that we provide to children, so that we're really providing what meets their needs where they are in that particular moment. And so for Save the Children, that means that what we are looking at is providing emergency humanitarian need to those children who really need it, but also to look at what we call early recovery programming, which is looking at children who are living in areas where they are in relatively protracted displacement, where the biggest challenges can often be economic rather than security, and looking at rehabilitating their school buildings so that they have windows and doors and can learn in safety without worrying that the roof is going to collapse or that there's no chalkboard or books. It's about making sure that their communities have piped clean water so that they have something to drink and they have something to clean themselves with, particularly during COVID. And it's about making sure that their parents have access to livelihoods and to jobs and to income so that they are able to provide for themselves and for their families, so that they can become less reliant on humanitarian assistance and start to rebuild their lives and live with dignity that the conflict has really tried to take from so many parents and so many children. It's about making sure that these communities, where there are pockets of relative stability right now, can become more resilient against these types of economic challenges, the challenges that COVID has provided, the challenges that displacement cause, and so that they are more resilient, that their rights are better respected, and that we as humanitarian actors are led by community needs, that we are being transparent and accountable to the communities that we help and giving them what they need in the moment that they need it. Early recovery is vital because these needs are becoming more complex. In northeast Syria, to give you an example, we have communities that have been facing protracted displacement, and the children that I talked about living in tents for 10 years who dream of walls. We have new displacements from new types of conflict. We have limited and really overstretched services, especially in towns and cities. We have a really dire economic crisis. And since last year, we've had a severe water crisis. And all of this is layered crisis on crisis to drive hundreds of thousands of children into crisis for the first time. So even children who have been fortunate enough to not be affected by the conflict have now been forced into camps. And families are making difficult decisions to leave their homes for the first time because they simply cannot afford to feed their children. They cannot afford clean water, and they cannot afford to send their children to school. And this is the real tragedy of Syria, is that it's the consequences of conflict that we are now seeing alongside the act of conflict. And both of these elements are being forgotten. To give you one example, I spoke to a 13-year-old girl just outside of Hasake last year. She lives on a farm that's full of fruit trees. And last summer, all of their trees died because of the water crisis. And her father said that this year they'll have to move if it doesn't rain and there's not enough water in the river that feeds their farm. And she told me, I'm worried about leaving for a place that I don't know anything about. I don't want to migrate and leave all of my memories behind. I want my memories to stay here, and I want to stay with them. And we really owe it to these children, to Baisalan, to other children like her and their families who are trying amidst incredibly challenging conditions to provide them a means to live a dignified and self-reliant life. This is not about us just providing humanitarian assistance and emergency need and providing food and water endlessly. This is about really trying to help children and their families live with dignity in the way that we outside of Syria expect and live in our daily way as well. Thank you, Arwa.
Absolutely. And live with a, certain level of agency as well. The right to be able to, chart your own future and whatever it is that you want it to be. And I think, throughout the last 11 years, maybe another of the big challenges, as there has been a lot of discourse about what kind of action to take inside Syria, there probably should have been, and maybe this is a lesson learned moving forward, an equally strong conversation about what are the consequences of inaction, because that's what we're seeing unfolding right now. And if we continue to have this level of inaction on Syria, it's going to be very difficult for any of us to actually predict kind of the ripple on and fallout effect of what that is actually going to be. So thank you for your insights. I really appreciate it. Our next panelists are with ORB, Gallup International. We have the CEO, Johnny Heald, who's also joined by Ayad Abdul-Latif, who's a Syrian himself. And I know it's very difficult to kind of talk about yourself, your own life, your own people's lives in these contexts. So thank you for being with us. And they're both going to, give us a short overview on the surveys that they've been doing with regards to a lot of what we've actually just been talking about, the aspirations, the concerns, the hopes of the Syrian people. So over to both of you right now.
Thanks very much, Arwa, and thanks everyone for having us. I have to say, if someone had said to us in 2013, when we first started to do qualitative and quantitative research in Syria, that we'd still be doing it in 2022, I don't think I really would have believed them. And also, having worked on a number of conflicts in Somalia, in Libya, Mali and Burkina now, for example, and having listened to a lot of the focus groups like Iyad has done, and myself, I've never heard as many horrendous stories coming out from Raqqa and Dezor and places like that in any other country we've worked in. So the impact on children has truly been horrific. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to share some, we're pollsters, so we want to try and put some data on it to try to help the audience understand, what Syrians think the main issues are. What they think about the international community, and we'll talk a little bit also about displacement. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see very clearly this is based off 3,000 interviews that are carried out face-to-face, scientifically random probability sample across all 14 governorates. So it's representative of the Syrian population. The fact that 1 in 7 people in Syria today fail to obtain hardly any essential food is really a horrendous figure. And you can see overall there the financial inflation, poverty, bribery, fuel prices, food prices, etc. When we ask people what are the main issues that you and your families are facing, it's those issues that come up top every single time. You'll see in the red box on the right a small increase in the last 2 years of people actually saying religious extremism again. So although we may have shifted our focus to something else, we may think that's over and done with. That and a combination of foreign influence has increased over the last couple of years. Next slide. I don't know, Ed, whether you wanted to talk about the foreign influence.
I mean, yeah, it's been significant in the last 2 years that there is an increase, and it's due to having so many. I mean, that's something new to Syrians, and due to the factors that you've already listed as the top issues people are facing. Many and more people, and even young in young ages, are turning towards more extremist views or extreme groups. Unfortunately,
and you can see. 3 and 5 rate Syria's economic situation as poor. I mean, undoubtedly, people are struggling massively. They're either blaming government corruption, or perhaps if they're outside government areas and being influenced by the media being disseminated to them, they're blaming economic sanctions imposed by the West, which is a narrative you're seeing played out again now in Russia. Next slide.
Sorry,
go on.
If we could go back on this, I think it's interesting looking at the regional differences. So even in suffering, Syrians have so much in common. So for example, when blaming government corruption for the socioeconomic condition, you would see that in Damascus, for example, the capital, 1 in 2 blame government corruption, and same thing in Latakia. While in Idlib, which is under a different control or out of regime control, a similar percentage, or 57%, say the same or blame government corruption. So different control, but same suffering. But the difference is even more interesting when it comes to blaming sanctions. So in Idlib, again, it's almost 17%, or 1 in 5 in Idlib blame sanctions imposed by the West, while this goes up to 72% in some regime areas like Sweden, for example. And this relates to what you were saying about the different propaganda or information shared in different areas.
Exactly. So, and on the next slide, if we talk specifically about education, we understood very quickly in places like Raqqa, etc., Dezor, even the most ardent supporters of Daesh, the wedge issue undoubtedly was education. They may have agreed with what they were offering security-wise against the regime, etc., but the one thing they could not agree with overwhelmingly was the way they were either failing to or actually educating children. Education has always been a wedge issue for Syrians, and you can see now, you're actually seeing an increase. If you look at the bottom 2 darker colors there on the right hand side, you're seeing an increase now of people. 62% of the population across Syria would say that it is a serious problem. So that's 2 in 3 households saying that education is a serious problem in the country, and yet, certainly from British government point of view, we turned off the tap for funding largely, not last year, a number of years ago, and yet the problem seems to be getting worse. I think if we move to the next slide, one of the interesting, 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe we were all sort of fixated with Syrians leaving and moving to Greece, etc., and we've probably lost sight of that in the last few years. But if you look at the data again that we do here, when we ask people whether or not they would be wanting to leave Syria if they could, it's actually increased from 2019 to 2021. So you've got almost half the population saying that if they could, they would still leave the population 11 years after a conflict. And we're now asking that question in the Ukraine, and admittedly you're 1 month into a conflict in the Ukraine, but the comparison in the Ukraine is that it's between 11 and 13% of Ukrainians that at the moment would say if they were guaranteed a safe passage, they would leave. they're still very much in the resilient stay and fight. 11 years on, you have almost 50% of the population who say that if they could, they would leave.
And as you were saying, this goes, sorry, on the previous one, this goes like, for now, we all see that the war is on the more calm side, but the crisis isn't over. So if you're looking at like half of those aged between 18 to 34 say they are considering leaving, and that bleeding of youth resources and talents is going to have more impact in the coming years.
And one of the places, there's leaving the country or there's internal displacement. So we've been running a number of projects inside our How camp over the last few years. And if we switch to the next slide, our How camp's been established for quite a long time. We've all been familiar with some of the trials and tribulations that have taken place inside the camp. But you've now got, as of, this was something we did in January this year, interviewing 500 people across the camp. You got more than 80% saying that it's actually getting worse inside the camp. So there's very few safe places for these people to move to. And if we move to the next slide, which is pertinent given the conversation and the way in which governments have been distracted now, attention is shifting to other conflicts. 3 in 5 people across all 14 governorates, a nationally representative sample of Syrians, would say that the international community needs to do a lot more.
And again, an interesting difference between, if you look at all the governorates above the red line, or the 60%, all out of regime control governorates, while the first 3, or the ones below the red line, are all in under regime control. And that relates again to the perceptions of international influence in some cases, or international aid in this case.
But last slide, what I want to do is offer a tiny bit of hope, because one of the questions we've tracked consistently since the beginning is, do you agree or disagree that despite our differences, there's more that unites Syrians than divides us? And I still to this day find it absolutely remarkable, and it shows you how resilient they are, that despite 11 years of conflict, 71% of people in the country still say that there is more that unites them than divides them, which to me is incredible. So I wanted to leave a glimmer of hope at the end, but thank you very much.
Thank you both for sharing that. And, along the lines of what you were talking about, I think, at our core, and sadly, this is something that is so often forgotten, we are all the same. We do have the same dreams. We do actually have more that unites us than divides us. We just all too often tend to act in a completely different way. And I also kind of wanted to add something that's a bit of my personal perspective, but that is even in scenarios where there isn't hope, or where there doesn't seem to be hope is something that can be restored. And, we see that, like, I see that especially through the work that, my charity does, where we treat children who have been impacted by war that other organizations are not able to access. But when a child begins to receive assistance, when they begin to be able to see the outline of a better and different future, you physically see hope return to that child's eyes. You physically see that little glint that kids have in their eyes, and this goes for adults as well, begin to return. And I think, maybe we all need to remember that even though it may seem like childhood or hope has been destroyed, it can at the same time be restored. And that's also something that we should all be working towards, especially when it comes to what's happening in Syria. So thank you both very much for that presentation. I appreciate it. And our next panelist is Dr. Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Malcolm H. Care Carnegie Middle East Center. Dr. Maha, thank you so much for joining us. We've heard a lot right now up to this point about, refugees, whether or not they return, and, to add to what's been discussed, up till this point. Also worth noting, I think, for a lot of people who maybe are listening in, is that these huge sprawling camps that we see, inside Syria for the internally displaced, where conditions are atrocious, and even in some neighboring countries, we don't actually end up seeing a lot of people returning. And that's a very big and important issue to discuss. And I know that you've done quite a bit of research on this, on why aren't Syrians returning? What dangers do face them if, in fact, they do return? Can they actually return to their homes? And so I was hoping that you could share some of the research that you've done on that and your insights as well.
Thank you, Arwa. I also want to thank UNICEF for bringing us all together for this event, and for everything I've heard today has been very moving and very heartbreaking, but also very close to the reality that we're living. Before I answer this question, I was struck as I was listening, but also looking at the numbers that were just shared, is the extent to which I think different Syrians are living different realities in Syria today. The country is not, when we think of a country, we think of a central state that runs a country or that governs a country. Syria is not in that situation at all. You have different parts of the country that are governed in very different ways and by different entities. So different systems, different entities. For people to be able to thrive in any environment, you have to have systems of accountability. You have to have a minimum of safety, protection, access to basic goods, food security, etc. These are things that Syrians across the board don't have. Whether in regime-held areas or non-regime held areas. So while they may be living, there may be different governance systems in place, it is very clear that the kind of distress that Syrians are feeling is pretty much across the board, though there is variance, of course, between different areas, because there is the capacity to use populations to pressure non-regime held areas, if you like. When we did our research, I think it was in maybe about 5-6 years ago, we did research with refugees who are in Lebanon and in Jordan. It was based on focus group discussions. And we were struck by the extent to which Syrians were very eager. Syrian refugees did not want to be in Lebanon. They did not want to be in Jordan. They wanted to go home. However, they were just unable to go home. And what kept coming up are a number of issues. One is, of course, the question of safety and security. There were no guarantees that they were going back to a safe environment. For mothers especially, the one thing I kept hearing from mothers was, how do I make sure that my child can go to school and come back in one piece? How do I make sure that they will not be caught in the midst of gunfires? There were a lot of issues that kept coming up, mainly around the future of their children, but also about the environment that they would be going back to. Another issue, if you like, that kept coming up was the question of accountability. Syrians were very worried about going back to an area, and they continue to be going back to the areas where they came from, where there's simply no law and order, that systems of accountability are not in place, that's where some of the people who are responsible for their misery are simply walking around and still running the show, and they're expected to go and live in this kind of an environment. I remember a young Syrian man saying, I can forgive the person who destroyed my home, but how can I live with the person who killed my father? And this is a theme that we kept hearing repeatedly. A third basket of issues, I think, that kept coming up is that simply the regime does not want Syrian refugees to go back home. There are mechanisms in place that the Syrian government, the current Syrian government, under the leadership of President Bashar al-Assad, has put in place to prevent Syrians from going back home, Syrian refugees. Some of these have to do with real estate, law number 10, the famous law number 10, that is literally appropriating the properties of Syrians who fled. There are other mechanisms in place, including these security checks on anybody who wants to go back home. If memory serves me, I think it was about 4 years ago, around 2,000 Syrians applied from Lebanon to go back home. They had just started opening this possibility. And only a very tiny fraction, I think maybe a couple of hundred, were given permission to go back home by the security services. For many young men, there is a concern about going back because then they would be forced to join the army. They have to do their mandatory military conscription. For the men who are outside, for these young men or young boys, often is the case, they were worried that they would be sent to the front lines. And they were hearing about stories of their cousins, their uncles, etc., who the moment they went back, they would go back to the military and would be sent to the front lines and get killed. So I think for people to be able to go back home, there are lots of quite some serious issues that need to be in place that would allow people a safe return. As again, they wanted to go back home. Another theme I kept hearing at the time was, even if my home is destroyed, I'm willing to put up a tent on my own land, on the rubble of my own home, but I would like to be back home. However, the conditions are simply not there. So I think we need to keep all of these things in mind. The Syrian refugee crisis is not simply a humanitarian crisis. At the end of the day, this is a political crisis with a humanitarian face or humanitarian consequences. So unless there is a real, genuine political settlement for the conflict in Syria, one that is sustainable, that takes the issue of refugee return seriously, that puts in place mechanisms for accountability, I'm afraid we're going to continue being in this kind of, with millions of people in a very vulnerable situation for decades to come. If I can just add one last thing also, the implications for this, for the future. If we look at the Arab region, just to zoom out for a second, I think UNHCR had put out a report. Every year they put out a report on the global refugee crisis. There were, if memory serves me again, 70 to 80 million refugees globally. This was before the Ukraine crisis. More than half came from the Arab region, and the largest portion were Syrians. And actually the total population is more than most countries. So I think if there is going to be as a resolution for this, there has to be a genuine political settlement that is both sustainable, but that considers the questions of accountability, transitional justice, access to services as central at the core. And we have examples. I mean, we do have examples where refugees were a central part of the political settlement. This is in the Dayton agreements. So I think that there are examples we can follow. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening today. As Marwan said, the move in the region seems to be towards rehabilitating and readmitting the regime of President Bashar al-Assad back into the Arab fold. The resonance of this is not going to remain in the region, but will go far beyond the region, because what this says is you can commit atrocities and you will not be held accountable. And this is a message that is global. This will not remain in the region. I'll stop here.
Yeah, of course. And then it emboldens anyone else who might be even thinking about carrying out something very similar. One of our viewers just asked a question, Stephen Andrews, that was kind of exactly about all of the issues that you addressed, but obviously a lot of interest out there about, why it is that people don't want to return. So thank you for laying it out in the way that you did. And I think, another thing that we do need to talk about, given everything that has been said by everybody, is what are the consequences of allowing the situation to continue as it is right now? So what happens if there isn't a political solution that is actually reached? And Bernard, if I could flip this over to you, Bertrand, would you say that there is a lost generation in Syria? And if we are going to be using this lost generation terminology, what does that actually mean? And can a lost generation's fate be altered? And again, what needs to be done right now to ensure that the status quo does not continue? And what are the consequences of allowing it to continue? And sorry, just before you answer that, let me address a quick little piece of housekeeping to anyone who has been tuning in. You can continue to send in your comments and questions in the comment sections, depending on where it is that you're watching. And sorry, Bertrand, go ahead.
No, thanks very much for your question, Arwa. This is a very challenging, difficult question. But, let's step back for a while and go back to why initially we launched the concept of the no lost generation. It's because we're so concerned and afraid that the crisis would be looked at only from a kind of security point of view, and we would overlook completely its impact on children. So we're afraid that actually, as we see now also in the Ukraine, you see that actually who are the first ones to suffer is actually children and women. So we were in the same type of scenario, and we still are in the same type of scenario in Syria. So for us, alerting the international community about the needs, the rights, the eroding, also deteriorating situation of children was absolutely key. Again, as I said earlier, not only for the situation of children right now, for those who are born and those who are living, but also for the future. I also would like to underline the point that you raised earlier, Arwa, through examples, and Johnny and Ayad as well, on, let's not forget that in the midst of this crisis, some people are fighting very, very hard to find solutions and to keep hope, even for their children. Parents are heroes in terms of, keeping their families together, trying to find ways to bring food to the table, sending their children to school, for instance. But also when you look at the health workers, the nurses, the teachers, they continue, doing their job. Can you represent, also we're speaking about, stock numbers, etc. Can you represent what it means for a doctor, a nurse, a teacher to continue doing their work when they have also their own children to also to protect, and still they do that. Still, 4.5 million children are attending schools in Syria. So which is great. When you look at beyond Syria, we should mention that also the amazing generosity of the neighboring countries. Neighboring countries have been able to integrate in their services also Syrian children. So they've been able to give them access to basic services and to give them a sense of a future. The sense of future that you were mentioning earlier, Awa, which is so important for children. So as Dr. Maha was saying, yes, it is a political crisis, and we need to find the solutions will be political, but it will also, we realize it will take some time. So what should we be doing also in the meantime? One is first to end some very egregious violation of rights, and especially of child rights. Ending the recruitments of children in armed forces and armed groups is absolutely key. Protecting them also from the violence, stopping the destruction, the bombing of schools that we've seen also happening in the past. That's one, and it's very much codified. The wars happen, but there are some codification of wars, and we see that violation against children's rights are due to the violation of a humanitarian, international humanitarian law. So in the meantime, also what we would like also very much to promote, and Kathy mentioned to it, is we need also to go beyond a pure humanitarian response. We need to help those who are continuing to deliver services, who are continuing to cater for children. So we need to continue to strengthen the resilience, because the resilience is still there, and we need also to promote early recovery, especially among communities and services. And that's sometimes is a heated political debate, including with the donor communities. We would like very much to, so far, has been putting some very strong constraints on the type of response and assistance we could deliver. So what we're calling for also as part of dialogue we've been having now with the international community, and which is evolving, we're really calling for fewer constraints in the way we can deliver assistance, the way we can strengthen the resilience, the way we can build early recovery for basic services. We want to have less political type of constraints imposed on us. For us, we start from the principle that every child, wherever they live, should be reached based on their needs. We need also flexibility. Having restricted funding to purely humanitarian assistance is not going to help us. We need really to cross a bit the bridge, humanitarian development, but the development part, I'm speaking about early recovery at this stage. And we need also to have also more predictable type of funding, multi-year. We know we've been already in 11th year of crisis. It's not going to end tomorrow. So we need to have also multi-year type of financial support, so that we can also be more flexible in the way we respond to needs. But I come back to the point that let's not forget that some services are still functioning. We have to make sure that they don't collapse. We need to strengthen the resilience of community and services. And recently we interviewed actually a 12-year-old boy, Hazam. He had lost his leg due to the conflict, and thanks to programs we were able to put in place with partners, both on education and social protection, he said, I'm glad I can go to school again. I have fun with my friends and I can learn again. Now, these kind of things we should not also forget, that actually by putting our assistance, our response in the delivering it the right way, we can help children function again. And indeed, there should not be, and there is no place for a lost generation to be. So thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, and when we talk about children being able to function again, I think it might be important to also, and I know, Catherine, you have a lot of thoughts on this, but if we look at what defines a child's psyche, especially at these young and vulnerable ages, within the war context, all they're seeing is darkness. And by not providing them with a pathway out of that, with these other opportunities, if a child is going to grow up in that environment, we are just as responsible for the type of person that they end up being as an adult.
Yeah, completely. We know that, in the Syria situation, like in many situations in the world, if you don't address this, it has, long-term type of effects. The scars we are mentioning, there can be, physical scars, emotional scars. If they remain only scars, that's fine, But if we see that we have new generations coming up now, again, going back to it's 11 years. So some children, even at the age of, when it started, they were 10. Now they are reaching, they are already adults. Okay, what does it mean for us? Can they function properly in terms of, in terms of desire to have a family, to be able to provide the good guidance they need for the children, to be able to also access kind of a decent and and regular type of income, as they're able to project themselves, so that they also can help their families to project themselves into the future. And as other speakers said, it has also, of course, implications from a security point of view in terms of stability of societies, cohesion. Johnny and Yahya spoke about the unity which is prevailing in Syria. We should not take it for granted. If we are not able to continue promoting, social cohesion and cohesion among communities, especially because communities now live together, but they were not necessarily living together in the past because of the huge numbers of displacement. So they have to learn now how to live together, which is not an easy thing to do, as we all know when we move from one place to another.
And I just really want to emphasize what Bertrand just mentioned about the need to think about children and their pathway into their future. I mean, we are here to make sure that children have a right to their childhood and a right to their education and a right to a happy life, but we're also here to make sure that they are able to develop and grow into healthy and happy adults. And when the humanitarian response, at least, is stymied by short-term, one-year programs that ensure that children are in school now, but we can't think about, will the child get a certificate at the end of their education pathway? Would they be able to go to university? Will they be able to train for the types of jobs that children tell us all of the time that they want? I mean, you speak to children across Syria and they will still tell you that they want to be doctors and teachers and nurses and architects. And are we really in a space where we are providing the right types of pathways for them to achieve that in their life? Well, this is why looking really carefully at the type of humanitarian assistance we provide now and trying to think longer term, as Bertrand said, is so vital. Because when we only are able to think year by year, we are thinking school year by school year. We are not putting in place the pathways and the future support that children will need as they go through life. Recognizing that that is about their education pathway. It's about the psychological support they might need to recover. It's about the fact that they might move to a different part of the country because they're displaced or they go home. It's all about how we are actually planning for children's futures and supporting that in the best and the happiest and healthiest way. And so we really, as humanitarian actors, also need to take responsibility of making sure that we are able to work with donors so that children and their families are supported, not just in the here and now, but as children grow up into adults as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Dr. Maha, I mean, we all do have a sense of responsibility, but there's also a role and responsibility of the international community and the United Nations.
Absolutely, Arwa. The United Nations protocols on how to deal with refugees need to be seriously reformed. Until recently, the response to refugee crisis around the world, perhaps with the exception of UNRWA, the Palestinian refugees, has been governed by the 1951 UN Protocol on Refugees, which basically required host countries to receive an unlimited number of refugees, even those with very limited resources. In the case of the Syrian crisis, Jordan and Lebanon in particular, while it placed no responsibility at all on donor countries to provide the help needed for these refugees. And even though this protocol underwent some amendments in 2018, they still fall far short of providing, real responsibility for donor countries in the same way that host countries are asked to receive refugees. We need protocols that would ensure a sustained flow of funds from donor countries to deal with the crisis. Right now, what is being done is that donor countries come in for a few years, provide what they decide is needed, and then they look elsewhere, as we have seen with the Syrian crisis. In the absence of UN protocols to guide this process, I'm afraid that the international response will always fall short of responding to the refugee crisis.
It's a very good point. Ayad, I wanted to get your perspective on this. As a Syrian, this is your country that we're talking about. These are These are your people. I mean, how do you see the consequences of allowing the current situation to unfold as it is without necessary action on you and your people?
Yes, Arwa. I think it's fair to say that there are many lessons learned from the Syrian crisis, and whether it's Syria or elsewhere, like we've seen from the data and from what we hear from people, interviews, and everything, we hear that so many people are still even planning to leave or would considering to leave the country if they have the chance. So it shows that the refugee crisis is still ongoing in a way, and I think there should be mechanisms in place to deal with that. And yeah, I think it's still ongoing. So there is still something to be done. It's not over.
Can I just add on the security point also? I think, you know, like as a father of 3 kids, unless you give kids some education, some direction, unless there is a community cohesion around them, kids become vulnerable. And let's not forget that there are a lot of people out there that prey on vulnerabilities in these countries. So, you know, I mean, Daesh may be defeated militarily, but that is not to say that they are defeated ideologically. And there are still people who would like that to continue. And they're the very people they'll prey on. You know, it's no coincidence now that the Kremlin is actively recruiting, was it 16,000 younger Syrians to go and fight? Now, all right, I mean, if you're earning $100, trying to struggle to get $100 a month, and someone comes in and offers 7,000 allegedly for 6 months, you can see how people, as Bertrand said, who were 10 at the beginning of the conflict and now 21, who have seen no progress, how they become vulnerable to other things.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, we know all too well that whether it's ISIS, Daesh, or any other, you know, organization that's out there, if you've grown up your entire life, you know, being treated as if you were, let's face it, trash, neglected, left in a situation of despair, and someone comes along and says, hey, I can give your life some meaning, here's money, here's a gun, here's a purpose, you know, people are going to turn towards that. One thing I do struggle with, though, on a personal level, is that we need to make that argument to try to get attention to a crisis, in the sense that, you know, we need to help Syria's children and Syria's youth so that they don't turn out to be fighters in the future, versus the fact that, you know, we should be able to say, look, this is a vulnerable population. These are people that have dreams and aspirations. It's morally the right thing to do to want to help them. Dr. Maha, I'm interested to get some of your thoughts kind of on this, and also going back to this whole question of what are the consequences of inaction? What is that sort of hypothetical pathway that Syria goes down if we do not address all of these critical issues?
The consequences are quite catastrophic, not just for Syria, I think, but for the region and beyond. We're looking at a generation. I mean, the cost of inaction right now is 11 years of conflict. We've tended to throw humanitarian funding at it as an international community, rather than try and deal with the actual political consequences of the conflict that just continues to get worse. The lack of action today means maintaining, as I said earlier, someone who has been accused of war crimes by the United Nations in power, and the ripple effects of that will be significant, not just in the region, but beyond. But I want to bring it back to Syrian children, but also the future of Syria and the future of the region. We're looking at millions of children who are not only out of school and no access to education, but even those who have had access to education, the quality of education has been not up to the standards that we would that would be needed for these children to be able to fund themselves in the future. At one point, there were, I think, 3, if we just look at the curricula, for example, there were maybe 3 or 4 different curricula being taught in different parts of Syria, depending on where you lived. Under ISIS, children were just being taught how to be the cubs of the caliphate. So it was more about how to brutalize others, and how to, it was about the lack of tolerance. So I think we need to go back also to this idea of what does education mean, particularly in a context that is witnessing so much strife and has witnessed so much tragedy. I was struck by the figure that our colleagues from RB put forward, where 70% feel that no, there's a lot more that brings Syrians together than drives them apart. This is incredibly important, and the place to begin focusing on this, if we want a better future for the country, for the region, and for the world, is in terms of what role can education provide in bringing about the kind of future we would like to see. I was on a commission recently of a report about the futures of education for the world. It wasn't just about Syria particularly. And what I was struck there repeatedly in all the discussions we were having is how central education is. It isn't just about the bricks and mortar. It isn't just about preparing young people for the job market. It's about the values that get instilled. It's about the skills that they learn. In a world that is changing rapidly, the job market is not what it used to be before. It's a world that is uncertain, that is unstable, as we've seen in the past, especially in the past 2.5 years with the COVID. We barely had a breathing space, and then we were hit with the Ukraine crisis. So, and with technology, change is happening very fast. And I'm afraid we're leaving millions of children not simply without access to basic literacy skills, whether it's reading or numerical, but also without the ability to fend themselves, but also without the ability to actually develop the kind of civic values that emerge, that education can provide for them. So I think the problem is very multi-layered, and I am very worried about the future and where this can lead.
Fair enough, as we all are. Couple comments from our viewers. Alexandra, thank you for pointing this out. Before I get to that one from Robin, the story about the 16K Syrian fighters. At CNN, we did try to stand that up. We were unable to do so. So at this point, it has not yet been confirmed. What we do know, however, is that there are attempts that are just at the very beginning in terms of recruitment inside Syria by the Russians, mostly within regime-held territories at this stage, but nothing to that scale of numbers or any sort of deployment happening just yet. Of course, that being said, it still is a very, very vulnerable, easily targeted population. Robin has a question about how amenable the international donor community is to providing the multi-year flexible funding required to address the continuity of the issue of education. Thank you. Very good question. And the overall early recovery efforts that are required. I am going to toss that over to Catherine to address that for you.
Thanks very much. And I'm afraid the short answer is not very amenable, but the longer answer is slightly more complicated. I think we do have a challenge with the fact that needs are growing in Syria and emergency needs are growing. And so there is a tension between 12 million people who need food assistance because they're food insecure this year, and the need to invest in education. And so we are seeing donor funding going down in Syria. This happened even before Ukraine. We expect it's going to get worse and more challenging. And so there is a need for us to, for events like this, to make sure that we don't let the donor community off the hook in terms of forgetting and neglecting Syria. The other really big challenge, and Bertrand alluded to this earlier, is that there are many donor restrictions on early recovery because there are concerns that early recovery means support for reconstruction to the government of Syria. And so that means that, for example, rehabilitation, physical rehabilitation of schools when they've been damaged in attacks or have been damaged by years of underinvestment can be impossible because some donors believe that that equates to the reconstruction of Syria and therefore support to the government. And so we are in very difficult, protracted conversations as the humanitarian community to try to make the difference between what is child focused and what is of benefit to children and the community they live in, to make their lives better and safer despite the fact of the conflict, and what would be support to the government, and making it clear that our interventions as a humanitarian community and as humanitarians is to support more dignified lives for children. And it's outside, and that exists outside of politics. But when we are not able to build a school for a child, but we can put a fire extinguisher in a tent to make it safer, is that really providing dignified and longer term assistance? And is that really the best way to help these millions of children that have been so affected by conflict? We would say no. And that is therefore an active conversation that continues with donors to ensure that they also start to see that these decisions that they're forcing us to make cannot be tolerable for very much longer. Thank you.
Bertrand, I know you wanted to add on to that.
No, thanks. I mean, I think Catherine, summarized where we are now. We have also to realize that there is also an internal debate now within the international community. I think for them it has been also 11 years, and they realize that actually when they evaluate or monitor the impact also of the assistance delivered, they start asking questions for themselves. As Catherine said, we are constrained by UN resolutions about how far we can go in terms of the assistance we can provide. But the window now we have is about what we call resilience and early recovery, which is basically also to make sure that the systems which are still existing are not going to further collapse. The interest of the international community along these lines is actually threefold. I mean, first, they realize that if we develop only a pure humanitarian type of response, is going to be short-lived. It's not going to be integrated to anything, and it's going to be very short-lived. So the impact will be very limited. The second argument, which they are willing to listen to, is exactly about the arguments that Dr. Maha put on the table, which is about the quality, the quality of the services. Let's be frank, if what type of education could we provide through humanitarian restricted type of funding? We call it education. Was it really education? Was it resulting in any type of learning for the children? Honestly, many of us, and including the donors, start questioning that. So it means that for them also they need to relook at their own strategy. And the third argument is a cost argument. It's less costly actually to support systems, services which are existing than developing parallel ones. So it's more effective, more cost efficient, but also you can reduce the dependence on humanitarian assistance. So this is a type of lines of argument along which we engage the donor community. As I said earlier, we have opportunities now. We have a very important senior level meeting happening on the 1st of April, bringing all the international community, looking at issues of Syria, zooming in also on a particular very distressful pocket area in Syria, which is, of course, the northwest, where millions of families and children are trapped with very limited type of assistance there. But they're going to look at also the broader issue about how we can, a bit stretch the type of assistance we provide, strengthen the resilience, strengthen the early recovery, and so that we become a bit more effective and generating better results that have been generated so far.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. We're just about nearing our time. And so I wanted to do a round robin with everybody, kind of addressing this one question, which is a lot has been discussed here. There's a lot to digest, a lot to walk away with. So from each of your perspectives, what is the one key thing you would want a viewer listening, watching this to really walk away with? Starting with Maru, please.
If I can start, Arwa, I think the one issue I would like people to be left with is the importance of investing in the children, in Syrian children education. This is an investment in the future of Syria, regardless of the current political situation. If the international community is not able to affect the political situation in Syria and bring about a political settlement, then it owes it to the future of Syria, to Syrian children, to invest in their education. This is not an investment in the current, in the present, it is an investment in the future.
Bertrand? I think we're having an audio issue there.
Sorry. Maybe just building on Marwan's point. I think, if we want to continue to invest in education, we need to have the means to do that so that education is of better quality than it has been so far. So I go back to my point on maybe 2 points I would make. One is we need to link it up also to the need to expand also programs which address mental health, to address the psychological wants of children. But we need also from the donor community. And here also, I would like to include also the regional actors who can possibly provide greater support, financial support than they've been doing so far. And I have particularly in mind the countries of the Gulf, but to provide us some more flexible type of funding so that we are not restrained. We can really invest in the quality, including of education, so that education can be really an issue that we can address properly as part of for children in Syria.
I'd just like to add that I think that the international exhaustion that I think people feel about Syria now is nothing compared to the exhaustion that children and their parents living through this feel every day. And as the international community decreases funding, turns its attention to Ukraine or the next crisis, they're leaving behind a generation of children. And the children born at the beginning of this war stand on the cusp of adolescence. They have their entire lives ahead of them. We literally cannot afford to let them down. And that requires sustained and appropriate engagement to ensure that through education, ensuring that because their families have jobs so that they can pay for their food and their rent and a safe place for them to play, that they can grow up healthy and happy.
For me, I would say that as a Syrian and as a researcher since 2011, the question that I've been facing the most is what do Syrians want and what do they need? And whether it's political efforts or humanitarian aid or anything, I think now we have more and more, we have the resources, we have the tools to actually ask Syrians what they need and what they want, and to tailor every detail of to that.
Johnny?
I mean, my simple message would be don't give up. You cannot give up on these people after 11 years. There is a glimmer of hope there. It's not easy. It requires a huge concentrated effort, but you cannot give up on these people now. It will judge you very, very, very poorly in history.
Maha, please go ahead.
Yeah. I would concur with all the messages that have come up from my co-panelists, but I would add one more. Not only don't give up, but actually invest the time needed in a just political solution for the Syrian conflict. This will, without that, Syria will continue to be an epicenter of instability for the region and beyond. I want to go back to a point you made earlier. I think that without the Syria conflict, we may not have seen Ukraine, I think. And it's a point, I mean, this should be a major lesson learned. And of course, investing in the children and the future, in all of this, I completely concur with. But this is a political issue and it needs the proper investment in time, resources, energy, and creative thinking in terms of where we can go forward, and no shortcuts. Shortcuts a la what we're seeing today is only going to bring more problems down the road.
Well, thank you all for your thoughts, for your insights. I also want to thank everyone who's tuned in to join us for this discussion. You've given us something very important. You've given us your time for the last hour and a half. And for my part, I would just like to add on to what everyone else has been saying. And that is that even though situations do seem to be quite complicated, quite hopeless, quite overwhelming, hope is something that can be restored. And perhaps on a more practical, global perspective to that, we cannot afford to allow a population, any population, to be left to fester on the sidelines. There will be consequences about that. And there is money out there. These are all problems that actually can be solved. It's about whether or not we're able to find the collective will to do so. So thank you all so much once again for joining us. And as you'll be seeing on the ticker on the bottom, you can also get a recording of this panel discussion that is available on the Carnegie Mina YouTube channel. And that's my cat.